Good morning and welcome to our webinar. For those of you on the webinar this morning, we want to thank you for attending and just remind you, if you are on the webinar, you are in listen-only mode. However, you can ask questions of our panelists by typing them into the question box, and there'll be time to address your questions at the end of the session. Just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and it will be posted to the CSDE's Performance Matters Forum webpage along with the slides, which are also available in the handout section that you may download during the webinar. I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, Megan Alubicki-Flick. Megan.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here this morning to discuss the important topic that we'll be discussing with a panel today. This is our Addressing the Needs of Newly Identified Students Through Individualized Education Programs and Instructional Supports webinar, and I'm pleased to be here today with my CSDE colleagues, Michelle Rosado, who already introduced herself and is assisting us behind the scenes, along with Michael Sabados and Janet Stack.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. What we're trying to do here is put out a series of virtual PD sessions. We love to do these kind of panels with district people where we present some statewide data that kind of orients a conversation around different topics where district people will share their expertise. Our goal out of all of this is really to get a conversation going around different topics because you folks are the experts. And what we like to see is the sharing of resources, the sharing of knowledge across districts on these different topics. So for this year, we're starting with this for the duly identified students, but we're going to be presenting PD sessions that deal with L trends. We're going to talk about welcome centers probably in December, and then probably next year we'll talk about the seal of biliteracy, and maybe we'll return to bilingual programs, and there might be more added too as we go along. So thank you again for joining us, and let's start with introducing our esteemed panel.
So I have the honor of introducing our panel, which we are thrilled to have with us today. These educators are from around the state and are experts not only on working with English learners, but also on working with newly identified students and that shared space of students that are English learners and are also students with disabilities. We have with us today Laura Blake, who works for the Connecticut Technical Education and Career System. Laura does not have her camera on, but we're thrilled that she is here nonetheless. We also have Kendra Dickinson from the Colchester School District, Jane Glenn from EastCon, which is one of our RESCs, Cassandra Perrone, who is from the Norwalk School District. When we were thinking about folks that had this particular knowledge, we looked at a document that had been submitted by a variety of educators on a different matter. It was related to a different work stream. And we just kind of blindly looked down the list to see who had this particular expertise. And when we did that, we identified 4 people, and then we looked over at the names and districts that they were associated with and found that we had this really, really interesting distribution of folks between Laura, Kendra, Jane, and Cassandra. So we have a large urban district, we have a low incidence district, we have a RESC, and we have the CTEX represented. So that was coincidental, but an excellent coincidence. So at this point, we're going to go into our state trend data, a conversation around that Michael will be leading. We're going to turn off our cameras at this time, other than Michael, if you wish to keep it on, and then we'll be moving into the district-specific information.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to be doing here is just kind of providing some general data to set a statewide context for our conversation around these things. And you know, as a data analyst, when you do these presentations, you always kind of hope for the opportunity to present surprising data or counterintuitive findings. Unfortunately, today, that's not going to happen. I think what we're going to see is things that you folks already know. But it's interesting to sort of have that statewide perspective in our minds as we start to hear from the individual districts. We have our conversation around particular issues. So first of all, the L population, we're talking about 45,000 kids nearly in the last school year. And to me, that's amazing to be able to say. When I started over a dozen years ago, it was just over 30,000. So that growth is really amazing. And of these almost 45,000 students, we're talking about over 9,000 students who are L and have been identified as students with disabilities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the growth, what we're looking at here is we're doing a comparison. We're saying if 2015-16 is our baseline, what was the growth in the number of students with disabilities over the succeeding 4 years? So we're making that comparison for each year to what was true in 2015-16. And it's interesting, the blue line is the students who are L in special ed. And over that period, their numbers grew by 39%. It's pretty remarkable. 11% for those special ed students who are not English learners. Now, of course, that's the larger group, so you wouldn't expect to see a large percentage of growth, but 11% is still pretty significant for that size group. And when I look at this, I mean a couple of things. First of all, for Ls in general, the growth in their numbers. Ls grew by about 24%. And I think a lot of that has to do with our identification process being standardized in 2017, particularly where districts might have had a choice between testing whether a student was L or not based on 1 or 2 non-English responses to the home language survey, going to now our standard process where if it's 1 non-English language, you're testing the student to see if they're an L or not. That certainly has affected these numbers. I think the validation of the students who are meeting mastery, I think that has to do with it also. Another thing is even just the tracking of the students when our student databases. We know this is a mobile population, and tools like EdSite and PSIS and PowerSchool are now giving us the ability to be able to track the students' L status across time and make sure that kids don't fall through the cracks like they used to in the past. And I think another that we're going to keep coming back to is assessment, but more on that later. But just putting this 39% into perspective, for Ls who are not special ed during this time period, their numbers grew by 20%. So this subgroup of Ls, their growth is really quite remarkable. Next slide, please. So here what we're looking at is the percent of Ls by grade who have been identified as students with disabilities. Now, the bulk of this population, K to 5, you know, with 36% just being K to 2. And it's interesting in those grades, the percentages of kids identified as special ed is pretty on par with their not L peers. But then you see it starts to grow in grade 3 and then continues to grow through middle school and stay pretty high during high school. And we're gonna talk about this a little bit, but I think certainly part of the issue here is about assessment and kids being able to test out. Janet, Megan, and I just did a presentation or just did a paper on high school Ls. And one thing that we saw was that 75% of the growth in the number of high school Ls over a 5-year period was the growth in the number of students who are L and special ed. So you kind of see that group of kids who who are identified and then perhaps can't test out, and so they remain an L. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the demographics of these kids, 83% of the Ls who are identified as students with disabilities have a native language of Spanish. And that's a little higher than Ls in general, which is about 70%. But it's important to note on the other side of it is that these Ls who have been identified as students with disabilities, they speak 99 different languages. So you have this real concentration of kids who are speaking Spanish or Portuguese, 7%, and then 96 or 97 other languages, low incidence languages, presenting a challenge for districts to be able to provide services, but also communicate with parents in these low incidence languages. Next slide, please. So in terms of the primary disability, about 2/3 are students with learning disabilities or speech language impairment. But what also jumps out at me here is the doubling in the number of kids who have a primary disability of autism, and a tripling in the number of specific learning disabilities, dyslexia students. Of course, that's a smaller number, so you can have larger growth rates, but that certainly stands out. Next slide, please. So I was just looking at some other demographic factors, characteristics of this population, and the immigrant one just kind of jumped out at me. 23% of Ls are immigrants, and yet only 4% of Ls who have been identified as students with disabilities are immigrants. I don't know quite what to make of that. I don't really have any speculation around that, but that just struck me as odd. Also, with this population, about 3/4 of all Ls are eligible for free or reduced price meals, but even a higher percentage of these dually identified kids are eligible for these reduced price meals. Geographically, about 3/4 of these kids are in the Alliance districts, just like all Ls. So there is that concentration too. However, 170 districts in Connecticut have at least one student who's an L and also identified for special education. Next slide, please. Now, ESSA asked each state to define a long-term L and to report on their numbers. And so Connecticut, based on national research, has gone with the definition that a student who's been an L for 5 or more years is considered to be long-term. So when you look in the L population and you divide by, you kind of filter out, or you look by special ed status. Ls who are also special ed status, 57% of those kids have been an L for 5 years or more, in comparison with just 25% for those kids who are an L and not identified for special ed. Next slide, please. So turning to the assessment results, and this kind of gets back to those that sort of accumulation of students over time. Here, what we're looking at is the growth figures. And remember, these individual growth targets, and that's shown by the column called growth rate. This is the percent of kids who are meeting their growth target. Remember, these are individualized growth targets. They're based on how the student performed in the prior year. So it's not just one target fits every kid. So it's supposed to take into account a kid's starting level. But you see for the special ed kids, a very small percentage of them are even meeting their growth targets. They're not growing on the LostLinks assessments. Next slide, please. And therefore, it's not surprising that when you look at the kids who meet mastery, those kids who achieve mastery on the LostLinks standard and will be exiting L status, that percentage of kids who are special ed and L is very small. We're talking about 4%. in the prior school year, compared to 12% of those kids who are in L and not special ed. So what we're seeing is these students who are identified and simply can't test out. Very few of them have that ability to be able to test out. So they're in L and then they're in L. So I think that has a lot to do with the growth and the number of these kids. It's not the only factor, but it's certainly an important one. Next slide, please. So in terms of the subpopulation of students who would qualify for an alternate assessment, so those with the most severe cognitive disabilities, this is from the LOS-Links. And remember, that's the K-12, that's a K-12 test, unlike our academic assessments. So the number of kids who qualify for an alternate assessment range between somewhere 500, around 600 kids every year. That's about 1.4% of the kids who take the LOS-Links. So that's another factor to bear in mind when we think about the growth in the number of this population. Is, as you folks know, there's no alternate ELP assessment. So for these kids with the most severe cognitive challenges, once they get identified as an L, there's no way for them to test out. That's it. However, the CSDE is participating in a consortium's effort to develop an alternate ELP assessment that'll be available in the next few years for these kids. So thank you. I appreciate your attention on this. And now we're going to turn it over to our district presenters, and we're going to start with Laura Blake from the CTEX.
Are you able to hear me, everyone?
We hear you, Laura.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So my name is Laura Blake, and I am a teacher, an EL teacher for the Connecticut Technical High School System. For those of you who aren't familiar with the technical school system, we have 17 schools located across the state, and we have about 17,000 students that we service. The trade schools are unique in that they have a dual purpose, right? Every CTEC student has the opportunity to get an academic diploma and a trade certificate when they graduate from Cheney, from any of the technical schools. The academic diploma is just like any other academic diploma. It includes all the state of Connecticut public high school graduation requirements. And the trade certificate is something that is sort of modifiable in that the kids can stack their certifications, which means as they pursue their trade, they can earn different levels of certification so that when they graduate, they just have, to enhance their postgraduate opportunities. So it's a unique system, but there are many hardships which specifically present as difficulties for our duly identified students. The biggest problem, which you can see at the bottom of the slide here, is in order for us to divide our curriculum between trade and academics, we offer the kids a complete academic program, but we do it in just 91 days. So 91 days a year, as opposed to 182 days a year. And similarly for the trade certificate, that has to, that happens in 91 days of instruction per year. So your average math class or your average history class, we have to condense it down and instruct it in just 91 days, which you can imagine that presents some real difficulties for our English language learners and our special ed identified students. Next slide, please. So here are exactly, like I was saying, some of the concerns for our duly identified students. Initially, when we get referrals to our school system, people think, or sending schools or families think, oh, my student will do great there. It's hands-on. It's a tech school. It's hands-on, and it is hands-on, and it has a great hands-on component. But that's only 91 days. The other 91 days are a super rigorous, fast-paced instruction, as we literally cover 2 days of material every single day, so that we can get the kids to their diploma and meet all of the standards of the state requires. Another concern for our duly identified students is sometimes trade safety, either language weakness or some, whether there's impulsive or sometimes unsafe behavior in trades can really put some of our duly identified students in jeopardy. And it also can make the trade school system not an excellent choice for students who are duly identified. High level of independence, right? So while you're in trade, sometimes you're overrunning a lathe or running a pretty major machine, and you are doing that independently because the trade instructor has 18 or 20 kids in the shop, and they are working with one group on one thing, and there could be another group working independently in another grade. So the trade system really requires a high level of independence for their students. And the last piece, which is another struggle that we just are constantly working on with our kids, is that it requires an intense level, not just of academic vocabulary, but of intense technical language, intense technical trade-specific vocabulary. So those are just different barriers that you might not consider when you think about the trade system. Our intake process for duly identified students is pretty simple. It's an application process open to all learners. There's no academic or behavioral criteria in the application process at all. Strictly a lottery, right? You can apply, and if you're chosen, you can get in. Acceptance is done in phases, sorry, typo, requiring timely responses from the family and eventually a commitment to attend. This is where we get bogged down right here. The requiring timely responses from the family is sometimes a adversity for some of our families. And that is an area that we have to continue to work on because there's a communication gap, and sometimes responses are not timely received, and then students' commitment to attend is affected by that. CTEC hosts or is invited to a PPT to discuss identified students' learning needs. So we're very careful about that. We always try to have a spring PPT with the sending school, and if not, then we have an early fall PPT to discuss the identified students' learning needs. And then the team decision is made as to whether or not CTEC is the right placement for the student, given some of those other variables that I talked to you about, like safety and things like that. Thank you. That's it. That's an overview of the CTEC system.
And at this point, we're going to move on to Jane Glenn, who's going to share EastCon's context. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Laura.
Hi, welcome. Thank you, everybody. At EastCon, we are a RESC in the northeast corner. We are a low incidence district, and within our district, we have 3 magnet schools, an autism program, and 2 clinical day treatments. And often our service providers work within many of our LEAs, and we serve 39 LEAs from across the state of Connecticut. Currently within our district, 100% of our ELs are native Spanish speakers. That is now, that hasn't been the case all the time. And 78% of our ELs in this district are duly identified as students with disabilities. So I've listed those students, some of the disabilities that we're working with: autism spectrum disorder, verbal and nonverbal, intellectual disability, hearing and vision impaired, specific learning disabilities, and emotional disturbances. So as Michael was showing in his previous slides, we are in line with many of the data that he demonstrated in those slides. And the current caseload for our ELs are grades 6 through 12. In terms of identification within our schools, our students come in identified. So at that point, we start working with the LEAs. And I think it's crucial for us, the case management starts to happen with the families and the parents, especially I'll tell you my experience working at the magnet school. I start immediately working with the families, even though the student is identified. Sometimes they come in with IEPs that are not translated. I help translate those IEPs. I start working with the parents. We start looking at what are the needs of the students, so we can talk a little bit more in this presentation about identifying students and how those things are happening. But I would say that working with this community, highly Spanish speaking, I've been working in this community now since 1990, teaching adults, starting adult ELs, and now I'm working, fortunately, with bilingual special ed students. So I can say I'm fortunate to work with this community. It's a very caring and loving community, that is for sure. And I'm very proud of the work that East Con has been working on. So I'm looking forward to talking in our discussion later. This is just a couple of our, this is Diane Dugas, who is the Director of Leading and Learning for East Con, and also my contact information.
Thank you very much, Jane. And we are going to transition over to Kendra Dickinson of the Colchester Public Schools.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm the English Language Coordinator for the Colchester Public Schools. We are a low incidence school, some might say micro incidence. We have 11 English learners, and we have a lot of diversity in our small town. So we have languages including Spanish, Mandarin, Tuyakan, Korean, Haitian Creole, Albanian, and Jugardi represented. One of the questions that we began to think about as we were preparing for this webinar is how do we make sure that there isn't a delay in identifications of our English learners? I think certainly it all begins with purposeful teamwork and collaboration and bringing all those voices into the conversation early. I also think that, and the research shows that the utilization of true peer data is essential. When we're looking at an English learner, and we're considering if the English learner needs to go through the evaluation process, we really need to look at our true peer data. And sometimes this involves teaching others how to use true peer data as well so that we can accurately assess and track the growth of the English learner. When it comes to the PPT process, there's a lot of ways in which the English language service provider can really be a team player in that process. One thing that I think is really helpful is at the end of the school year or at the beginning of a new school year, it's really important to put the annual review dates and the triennials on your radar as the EL specialist. Sometimes our special education case managers are case managing 30 students, 40 students, but if we as the EL representatives take the initiative and say, okay, coming in May is going to be this person's triennial, coming in June is going to be this person's annual review, we can reach out proactively and say, hey, please kindly make sure that I'm invited to the PPT or to the triennial. I'm really interested in being a part of the process. As we sit down at the table for the PPT and begin to utilize that IEP process, we want to make sure, of course, that the child's home language is represented. We also have an opportunity in the PPT process, in the PPT notes and summary, to share with the team and with the family the service that we have been providing to the child. So whether that's a combination of push in or pull out, how many minutes or how many hours we see the child, and the specific goals and objectives that we're working on. And we can make it really clear that we are supporting the goals and objectives that are outlined in that IEP paperwork. And really send the message that we're a team supporting your child every step of the way. It's also important as you get toward the end of the PPT process to make sure that we have a chance to give input pertaining to the Locked Links assessment. And as was shared before, it is a smaller group of children that will be exempted from the Locked Links, but I think it's an important conversation to have in the PPT process.
Thanks so much, Kendra. And now we're going to turn it over to Cassandra to discuss Norwalk Public Schools.
Thank you, Megan. My name is Cassandra Perrone. I am the EL data and testing facilitator for Norwalk Public Schools. This is my first year doing this full-time. Prior to that, I was an L teacher in the elementary schools since 2006. Just a brief snapshot of what our population is like in Norwalk. We have, at this point, almost 12,000 students, a very diverse community. As of Wednesday, we had 1,982 English learners. That's about 17% of our total population. 435 of those Ls are dually identified. 43% of NPS students speak a language other than English in their homes. The majority are Spanish speaking. However, the students also speak 59 different languages and come from 76 different countries. Next slide, please. So my job, I work in the English Learner Welcome Center, which we are very lucky to have here. I oversee the bilingual facilitators. We work as a team. I make sure that the Lost Links testing happens and organize that through the district. I also communicate with other districts, especially regarding the L status of transfer students within Connecticut. I provide the class list and other data to all the L teachers in the district, as well as administrators and whatever other data is needed for various maybe grants or some other presentations. The bilingual facilitators that I work with, like I said, we are a very close team. We try to be, as much as we can, kind of a one-stop shop for families who are either new to the country, new to the state, and speak a language other than English. So between the bilingual facilitators and myself, we have InfoSnap for registration. We're checking that almost pretty much daily to see the responses of the home language surveys in an effort to kind of catch these students before they enter the schools and have them tested for eligibility before they enter the schools. That way we can communicate to the receiving school if the student is an L and what their level is. So we help with registration, the testing, the placement, and the pre-loss as well for those preschoolers coming into kindergarten. We help with health forms, lunch forms, transportation, technology, you name it. We do our best to help out our families, and also a big piece is that communication with the schools. And as part of our intake, we also complete a parent or guardian interview and an educational summary about a student, which that's part of our entire intake that we share with the receiving team of teachers. And sometimes we might, in conversation, hear that the parents may be concerned about this child academically or even psychologically, trauma, and we will get in touch with the right people, perhaps a special education administrator, just to alert them that there's something that might come up down the line, or something to look into, just to keep an eye on the student. And as far as trauma, we have a Trauma in L initiative in some of our schools, which is branching out into more schools, thankfully, created with bilingual social workers and other people who reach out to the families. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick overview of what's working as far as the teamwork between the L department and the special education department. We have bilingual aides in every elementary school. That's new as of last year, and we do use the aides to interpret at PPTs, and we're eventually going to be training them, which you'll see on the next slide. But we have our bilingual district parent coordinator, who is also available for PPTs or any general information that the parents might need, or communication between the school and a family. Each year, we do train the teachers on how to review testing accommodations, especially around lost links, but also for any other state or district tests that might be happening. New as of last year, we have a bilingual district ombudsperson, and her job is to really guide families and parents throughout the entire PPT process or anything that the parent is dealing with and needs help with. And she also connects them to community resources, which is really wonderful. The special education department has recently been doing Facebook Live parent forums to inform parents on anything new in the special ed or how to possibly advocate for your child. And there are interpreters available for those sessions. Again, I just want to mention how much we do share, that Welcome Center shares as much as we can, especially if we are concerned about a student before they step into the school. And that goes along with the open communication. We will also speak to the special ed department to get their feedback about a student. And new this year is Parent University, which is different. It's either a live presentation or a Q&A session available in English and Spanish for the families. And the focus at the beginning of the year was technology, as far as how to log on to Google Classroom, how to use Seesaw. This month is Digital Safety Month, and so again, all sessions would be available in English and Spanish. Next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we have the bilingual aides in each elementary school, and right now we're working on an in-house training on PPT protocols and best practices for interpreting. There was a joint initiative that had been started between the L education and special education departments last year, pre-COVID. Hopefully that will resume, just to increase that open communication and working together. We've been providing documents and other school communications, almost always in Spanish, like robocalls, let's say, but now we're working more to get Haitian Creole on there too, and ensuring that the L teacher is present at all meetings, including PPTs, to discuss language progress. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Cassandra. In sharing those initial information about the districts, our hope is that you can kind of relate to one or more of those contexts in your own district, and maybe be able to apply some of the things that are working in the various contexts that they shared. At this point, we're going to move on to some prepared questions that we shared with the panel in advance, and Janet Stock is going to be addressing those questions. And we encourage you also, as Michelle mentioned earlier, if you have additional questions that you would like to pose to the panel or all of us, please include those in the chat. And if we do not address them today during the webinar, those are questions that we can address after the fact. But at this time, I will turn it over to Janet and to our panelists to address some of the prepared questions.
Thank you, panelists and Megan. I think that was some wonderful information. And so at this point, we're going to move forward with some of our prepared questions, as Megan said. So the first one we're going to share with Laura Blake from the Technical High School System. And the question is, how do you communicate a duly identified student's individual needs to all staff who support the student?
Hi. Okay. So this sounds like a simple question, right? But of course, it's really not a simple question. We have to be really careful about HIPAA. And so we can't just send out mass emails or do mass presentations about our duly identified students to the general teaching audience at our school. Here at Cheney Tech, where I teach, we share IEP objectives. We don't even really share entire IEPs. We really just strictly share IEP objectives. And for ELs, we share learning plans or reading plans or individualized learning plans, whatever you might call them, but we share those. And we just really build the individual team of specific people that just see that kid. It's very complex at the technical school system because of the duality of trade and academics. It just gets muddy, but that's how we do it. We also use the SRBI process and data teams to talk about students more specifically. We use team meetings, grade level meetings. I mean, we use whatever format we can use that limits the audience to the specific people who need to actually know the information.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
The next question, and I recognize that we have limited time, so I want to make sure I don't mean to cut anyone off. So the next question is kind of 3 parts, and we presented it to both Cassandra and Laura to get different perspectives. So the first question, and I'll read all 3 parts so you're aware. How do you engage parents? How do you address cultural differences in identification and service provision? And what do you do in terms of providing communications in native languages to families? So let's start with Cassandra. And I know you touched on some of this, but I didn't know if you wanted to add more.
Sure. I would say as far as engaging parents, like I had mentioned that that Parent University was available now to help out, but also the bilingual family coordinator and the ombudsperson that we have, along with the Welcome Center. We do our best to reach out in any way, shape, or form to get in touch with families. I know that even, you know, when everybody was remote, that even teachers were using, let's say, WhatsApp to text with families just to be there for them, to make sure that somebody was communicating with them. As far as communicating, let's say, as far like with PPTs, again, we do our best to communicate in their native language if necessary, and if there is not an interpreter available, we can contract out with the language that's available, or we also use Language Line, which has been helpful. As far as the cultural differences and identification, I think that really comes with the L teacher being a part of that team and that process, and reminding others to look for a true peer if possible. Also, if a student is a newcomer, that there's no wait period that some people seem to think before possibly starting the SRBI process or going into the PPT process. It might be difficult to find a true peer, but you do have to take into account that language acquisition piece. And communication, I mean, again, the Welcome Center, we share as much information as we can. And that was, I think, I had mentioned that more communication would be in Creole, and that we try to do print and phone calls home in different languages.
Thank you, Cassandra. And we're also going to ask Laura, because of her unique environment as well, those same questions: engaging parents, addressing cultural differences, and providing communication in the native languages.
Right. So engaging parents really has, I mean, I've been teaching for almost 30 years, and boy, has that changed. We'll do anything we have to do: phone, text, email, parent square messages, progress reports, Google phone numbers, you name it, really. We had a meeting in the parking lot the other day while the parents stayed in the car, and we all stood around the car. I mean, it's like, you know, have to do what we have to do. One of the pieces that I want to bring up, though, that has really come to my attention is that there are many systems that we have in place that we are assuming work for everyone when in fact they do not work for everyone. So for the case of the many parents that I have whose native language and only language is other than English, they are absolutely left out of many of the common practices that we use in our communication. So for example, we use robocalls or Parent Square, and we send out messages to phones, right? So that the message gets delivered directly to their handheld device. The problem is if they choose the translation option, which they have the option of doing, it doesn't translate everything. So we were really resting on our laurels thinking we were doing a great job communicating, and they have access to Spanish language messages, but in reality, the system has some algorithm that it's using to weed out and choose what is being communicated. So that's my word of caution to you, is just be careful and really test out these different systems, see how they work, see how it is for the listener and for the parent. What are they hearing? How good of a quality is the translation? All of that we have to double check. We cannot just assume that the quality of the communication that's going home is the same for everyone, particularly when we're relying on translation services, electronic translations and things like that. As far as addressing cultural differences in identification and service provision, this is huge, right? And it is probably the reason for the over-identification of, or the reason for such high numbers of dually identified students. It's a delicate process, right? The balance between allowing language to develop normally and in the normal time frame that it requires versus a special ed referral for language concerns or language and learning concerns, that over-identification is likely a combination of two things. I would say it's a combination of impatience on the part of the team in the school, and it's probably the other piece is a lack of consideration for the understanding of language acquisition in general, right? So the team doesn't always understand what is language acquisition, what is normal language acquisition, what's a normal process for that, and what do we expect our students to be able to do, and in what time frame. And that is not easy research to do, and it's not easily, it's hard to put your fingertips on that data. Yeah. So sometimes the team can rush to referral because they're essentially everybody wants to help the student, right? That's the goal. It's not, the intention is certainly not to be harmful, it's to be helpful. But if we rush to referral, in many cases, we're overlooking a very natural and normal language acquisition process. So that's a big concern of mine. And also another piece about the referral process is sometimes we tend to ignore cultural differences that exist that we just don't understand, or we're just looking at it through the lens of our culture. So we're looking at behavioral differences, which might be quite typical in a culture and in relevant in that culture, not in the dominant culture. And so sometimes we're making judgments about students and their behavior or their performance or their productivity, and some of that could be related to cultural difference, and some of it could be related to different levels of priority in the home, right? Because that's different too. So just things to consider, but I always encourage people to try to change their lens and look at it differently. And I mean, the old saying, walk in somebody else's shoes, it's important. And if you're not sure about something, ask. Don't make those assumptions, and check with somebody who you think might be able to give you a little bit more insight in that particular area.
Thank you. Those are some really good pointers, and I appreciate that. Our next question, we're going to start with Jane and also Cassandra and Kendra. And the question is, how do you ensure that ELL and students with disabilities identifications occur in a timely manner? And I know that we did touch on this a bit in your slides, but it's a critical component. So Jane, if you could start us off with your thoughts, that would be helpful.
Yeah, Laura, I can't echo more what you're talking about. I think that it leads right into this other area of identifying in timely manner, yet we have to ensure that our students are being identified as ELs, and if there is of course, in my district, the kids come in identified with the learning disability or with the IEP, and then also, but we have an obligation. Everything is on a timeline, but I think that if anyone can remember, especially what Laura was talking about, being culturally sensitive, maybe the norms in the family are not, they're not accustomed to hearing about a certain disability about their child or accepting that. It takes a lot. It takes all of us to understand that. And we have a very fast-paced environment right now, especially trying to jam in kind of what's happening since March and trying to push everything in there. And it must be overwhelming for a lot of people. It's overwhelming for all of us, but also let's understand what's happening with our families. So we have an obligation to identify our students, to continue to service our students the best way possible. But I think that also being culturally aware and cognizant of the needs of our families and our students is especially important. And also being adhering to the assessments and adhering to our standards that we've always adhered to prior.
Cassandra or Kendra, did you have more to add?
Oh, sure. I just want to, I had already mentioned that we communicate as soon as the student comes to the Welcome Center, but I forgot to add that we also, in the middle and high schools, we give them kind of a math test too. So we can alert teachers if they have low math skills. We also mark off if they are SLIFE students, so they have that data right there ready to go. We also, like I said, we alert the schools if anything comes up, and then it's really the L teacher to kind of take that information and continue if a process needs to continue. Speaking from when I was in the classroom, it was really to make sure things happen in a timely fashion as best as I could, was just communicate, talk to your team, talk to the classroom teacher, talk to the special ed team, and just be there for your student.
Kendra?
I just kind of wanted to circle back to the idea of true peer data. And for someone that's listening that might not know that term, what that means is we're comparing students that have a similar educational background, a similar cultural background, a similar language background. So if there are concerns about a student, we can look at this student of concern, and we can look at other what we call true peers. It's one thing to sort of read about it. So if you go to school to be an L service provider, it's another thing to have someone really sit down and show you and teach you. And I was lucky enough to have a mentor in Norwich, Kristen Talley, who took a lot of time with me, because this is not a quick and easy process, and showed me, okay, how do you look at historical data? How do you look at all the data that the state of Connecticut has stored? And how do you make a true comparison so that when concerns are presented, you can say, well, this is the child whose language acquisition is just going to take time. Let's be patient. Or you can say, you know what, compared to this child's true peers, he or she is experiencing some difficulties, and let's try these interventions, or let's try these teaching strategies. So I just think that that's an important point. And when you are in a low incidence school district, it might be hard to find a true peer, but it's still important that we consider our Ls when we're looking at their achievement, that we're not only comparing them to our monolingual students.
Thank you. I think we're still doing okay on time. So one of the things that we're all dealing with is managing the transition to remote learning and the provision of services. Laura volunteered to start this ball rolling.
Okay, so I think we all struggle with that. I think that last spring and this fall are like two different worlds, right? Last spring was literally, let's just try to keep our heads above water. Let's just try to keep the kids' heads above water. Let's just race to the end and get to June. I don't think that maybe I'm speaking for all of us, I don't know. I did not think that September would look like this. In my head, it was going to be over the summer, and this would be a normal teaching year. So indeed it's not. And so here we are starting the year up. Ending the year in distance learning is one thing. Starting the year up is a totally different ball of wax. At the high school level, that means you've got 9th graders incoming who are completely unfamiliar with your school, your systems, your schedule, your people, your hallways. They know nothing of it. And so it's like this vague, ephemeral, drifting by cloud. You know, school has just become this sort of, it's more of a concept now than anything else. It's not a physical place for many kids. So I would say I would rather talk about this year than last spring, to be honest. We have put a lot of things in place that we are trying to just constantly build in supports for kids. We're trying to be really flexible in our scheduling. We're looking at things in a different way. We're interviewing kids. This is a great place to start. Find reliable kids and ask them, how's it going? I had a young man in my classroom this morning, great student, EL student, great student. Before COVID hit, he was at 80, 85. Those were his grades always. Right now, his grades are 40s, 30s. He's panicking. He literally was sweating in my room this morning, and he looked almost like he wanted to cry. He said, the work is not too hard for me. I just need more time. So out of the mouths of babes, he's telling me, you know, that's valuable. He needs more time. Doesn't have enough time. He said, I'm rushing from class to class. It's assignment after assignment. And then I get home and I don't really understand what I was supposed to do. The teacher kept cutting in and out during her presentation. The link isn't working. You know what I'm saying, right? And so this is a good to average student, and he needs more time. That's what he's asking for. And so to me, that's so incredibly valuable. I have to look at his schedule and find a place where we can carve out an hour or two during the week where he has more time to get his work done. So again, culturally sensitive. I know this student very well, but he's representative of many students. He helps the family work after school. So after school time is not homework time for him. That is a family priority. Okay, so again, you have to be culturally sensitive to this. That is their family dynamic. That is their family priority. He does not have time after school to do homework. Whatever he's going to get done, he's going to get done here at school. And so that is just a constant, right? And so that's just the way it is. And so we have to figure out ways to make that work for him and for all of the students like him. So, in his case, I'm looking at his schedule and I'm looking at, he's got 2 hours of math in the morning. He's a good math student. I'm saying to him, if you can get all your math done in an hour, you're going to carve out that extra hour. We'll pull you out of math and we'll give you some support. So creatively looking at schedules in a much more dynamic way. We have to look deeper, we have to look wider, we have to look everywhere for the minutes and the time that these kids need to get their things done. In our school, we're deciding soon, hopefully, that we're going to move to Wednesday work days, where Wednesdays are where we're not posting new assignments on Wednesdays, but their Google Meets are open that day, teachers are available, and it's just a day to catch up instead of the constant assignment. I mean, we're talking about screen fatigue too, so it's hard to ask a kid to be on screen for these 7 hours and then go home and get back on your screen and do another hour or two's worth of homework. So I think it's more realistic for us to expect that the school day is the only piece that we can actually control. And so that might be a personal opinion, but that's really all we've got, right? Is the part that we can control. We have to check in on their safety and on their wellness. That's really important right now. Kids are struggling. If you see their faces, right, they're like waxy, they look tired, they've got bags under their eyes. This is exhausting for them. It's very fatiguing, right? It's very fatiguing. So we have to make sure that we're checking in on all of that. The SEL stuff, the social emotional stuff is really, really important right now. And that creates that atmosphere of safety, right? Which is an important atmosphere for us to create in our classrooms and with our students, because that is where the learning happens, right? The affective filter can drop down, they can be comfortable and truthful and honest with you, and there's so much more learning that takes place when that happens, right? If kids are guarded, we know this, right? If kids are guarded and anxious and afraid, they're not receptive to new information. That's not a good place to be as a learner. We've
Thank
just,
you.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's
Sorry.
good.
Thank you for those insights, Laura.
You're welcome.
That's very helpful. And I wanted to touch base with Kendra about ensuring the language needs are represented at the PPT and in the PPT process. Do you have some pointers in that area?
Sure. So I covered this a little bit in my slides, but I think it starts with being a part of the team at all times. So it's a lot of conversations or connecting with any person that interacts with your English learner. Oftentimes that's the school nurse or the PT provider, OT provider, of course then it's an organic and natural process where you as the L service provider are a part of this PPT process. You also, as the L service provider, are in a unique position to make sure that during these PPT meetings, we have professional trained oral interpretation services, that we're not relying on a phone call at the last minute or a neighbor to show up, that it's expected and that it's the norm that we're going to have a professional oral interpreter that knows about confidentiality and that has the skills to be able to interpret sometimes some very complicated and language assessments, PT and OT assessments. The vocabulary involved in those can be very complex. So it's essential that we have a role not only to report on the progress in the language acquisition, but to ensure that the language needs of the whole family are represented, and this just becomes part of our normal process.
Thank you. That's helpful. And Jane, we were talking about developing goals and objectives, and how do you ensure that the needs of the student encompass the supports for that English learner?
Yeah, so again, the use of interpreter is very important. Sometimes it gets forgotten at the last minute. Like you said, don't wait for the last minute. Oftentimes I'm interpreting in those PPTs and it's difficult to play that dual role. Sometimes you need an interpreter plus a sign language interpreter. It gets very complex. You need an interpreter for the student, you need an interpreter for the family. So you want to make sure that you have done the work prior to the PPT. That also means that the people that are giving the assessments have also met with the parents. Let's remember that the student is the center of this discussion. Let's remember a PPT with the student present and speaking for themselves when possible changes the nature of a PPT. So those things are really important. And if your student comes in and they're only speaking Spanish and feel most comfortable in that, that tells a lot. That's informing the PPT about that student. And that student is talking about their needs. So I think that's very important. So I guess we've all echoed that. I do think that when we're developing goals and objectives for students, that we're ensuring that the background and culture of the student is taken into account. Again, we're talking about background and culture, how we're linking our interviews with families, how we're linking our contacts with the data that's taken in the classroom, the STAR testing or any other testing that's coming into our PPT, that we're taking that into account. We're developing that in there, including the lost links. But also, let's say we're dealing with a student who's from mainland China, and or for math is taught differently there, as opposed to Europe or Latin America or in the United States. So we have to be careful when we are talking about accommodations or the use of manipulatives or the use of visuals or the use of nonverbal and verbal cues. Be careful about our body language. There's so many factors here, but a lot of it has to do with getting to know the family and getting to know the student and the teachers and be a comfortable PPT team. Sometimes it's not all possible because we know it's a stressful environment, but the more that we can be prepared for that meeting, the more that we can work as a team and know that this child is the center of our purpose, and know that inclusion and making sure that we are taking into account that the student is included and the student has opportunities and the benefits of extracurricular, the benefits of participating in the arts, participating in sports, participating in what's happening in the school culture, and being included in the classroom setting. If we take those all into account, I think we're going to come up with some very nice goals and objectives that will help inform our PPT. It will help inform the classroom, inform progress for our student, which is what we all want, of course. We want them to develop and grow. The one other thing that I'd like to mention is that we have to take into account also this transition PPT that happens in high school. And I know that we showed very small percentage of data here for immigrant populations, but I do think that with working with the immigrant population, they're not going to be so forward and coming forward with the status. So we're talking about students that are transitioning out into the work world. Why don't they have, maybe they don't have working papers. There's all sorts of stigmas, as we know. There's all sorts of things that happen, and it's not always clear why the family is hesitant to come forward with that. That's just some of the things that I've seen in my experience with that.
Thank you, Jane. Can one of my colleagues tell me where we are in our timing? I want to make sure we have at least a little bit of time for questions.
So right now it's 10:10, Janet, so we have 20 more minutes. And I do see some of the questions from our attendees. So whenever you're ready for those, we can go ahead with those, but we do have 20 more minutes.
Okay, I think I had one more question on our prepared list. And Cassandra, this one we had discussed with you. And with summative assessments, how are decisions about accommodations made and communicated to the appropriate teaching and assessment staff?
Okay, so I think I had mentioned before that we do an annual training. I use that the slideshow that you provide about Lost Links. So we do review that with the L teachers who will be administering the test, but we also take a meeting or some time to meet with them and go over the accommodations that are available, clarify what they mean, what it looks like on the Lost Links or other tests that would be given. I've taught them how to go into PowerSchool and access their students' IEP and what pages to look at in order to see if there are accommodations listed, what's listed there. And if they're unsure about that, to set up a time to meet with the special education teacher that that student works with to get even more clarification to make sure that the students are getting what they need. Sometimes, you know, in the high school or middle school, it's really difficult to make that time because of all the different periods. And if that is a problem, then I don't have I make the time to reach out to the special education teacher and go through the students and make sure. We also, my office will provide a list to each teacher of their duly identified students of who they would need to speak to the team about.
Great, thank you. Very insightful answers. Thank you so much. So now I think what we're going to do is move to some of the questions that may have been entered in the question box. Michelle, are you going to read those for us, or how are we?
I have access to them. This is Megan. So I'll just go ahead. I'm not sure we'll have time for all of them, but again, those that we don't have time for, we will certainly get to after the fact. But I would like to start with this first one. How does the SRBI process look the same or different for L students prior to a student being identified for special education?
So can I say something? Yes?
Absolutely.
So the SRBI process, if it's done well, would move slowly and carefully through the tiered interventions, right? With particular focus on tier 2 interventions. And so just this, the idea is that the tier 2 interventions, if you come up with a tier 2 intervention and you implement it and you mark your timeline and you take your data and that intervention didn't work, it's okay to move back to tier 2 and come up with other interventions. I have experienced sort of single intervention tier 2s where we tried one and it didn't work, let's go to referral. And again, it's about that sort of patience and make sure that your SRBI process is really targeted a question. What question are you trying to answer? What are we looking for? What kind of improvement are we looking for in the student? What are specifically the students' learning problems, right? What do we actually see? Sometimes in SRBI, I see really general, vague questions like he doesn't get his work done or something like that. Something just really vague that could be a million different reasons, right? And also, I always encourage people in the SRBI process to make sure that you weed out the most simple things, right? Quickly, eye exam, hearing, get those things done quickly because those are oftentimes overlooked, and particularly at the high school level, because you are kind of assuming it would have been caught by now, right? Glasses. We just got a student a pair of glasses. It's like a brand new world. Suddenly his grades went from 40s to 80s. He couldn't see, right? That's really simple. He's been in our SRBI process for a year and it just got overlooked. And I mean, there is no more simple solution than that. So, be creative in that process, but really a good SRBI process is really driven by excellent questions that you're trying to get answers to.
Thank you for sharing that. Oh, looks like Jane, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just to put a promo in here for the lost links. We just started. We're really tracking that data now, and it's been very helpful. I can't tell you, since I think Michael's showing us data from 2017. I'm sorry, so I think that now that we're tracking the students more using the EdSite data, I think it's really helpful to come into those SRBI and be able to inform the team that with that data about where these students lie in terms of their language acquisition, so that, hey, this may not be a learning disability at all. It just may be that the student is still learning how to listen in class, learning how to, and really teasing out, why is this something about language acquisition? It could be very possibly. It's not ADHD. It's the student doesn't understand what you're saying. So how can we help? How can that bilingual piece? How can the EL services, or how can we support a teacher who does not have bilingual services available to them show growth with that student rather than the immediate referral to special ed, or also, right, the SRBA process is it's a response to intervention. So how can we intervene in order to best help the student?
Thanks for sharing that information as well, Jane. Those are really practical strategies. And I also want to I would be remiss not to remind folks, based on that question, that EL instruction is tier 1. So we should not be thinking about our L instruction as being beyond the scope of tier 1. That's not to say that Ls are not entitled to receive tiered interventions like any other student, and should they need them, by all means, it would be appropriate to provide them. But their general L instruction, whether bilingual, ESL, sheltered instruction, or whatever models you're offering, are tier 1, a part of that student's general education program. So that's just essential to keep in mind. And I want to underscore the earlier comments that we had around true peers. So with the SRBI process, it's really essential to remember that the trajectory of academic development for an L may differ from native English peers. So we want to be looking at that trajectory and see improvements and developments for our L students, but what that looks like may differ, not only from one student to the next, but also from Ls to non-L peers. So those are things that are really important to think of. And I think we've mentioned several times in the conversation today that it's really important also to ensure that we have somebody representing the students' language needs that's a part of that SRBI team. Or if for a student that has a disability, that the language needs of that student are represented on the PPT. So that's really essential as well. I'm looking at another question here. What kind of student language profile would necessitate a bilingual assessment for an IEP? I wonder if not only are these for you as the panelists, but I didn't know if this might be something that Janet might wish to comment on, Michael, etc.
I know when I was back in the classroom in the school, there's a form that we fill out usually, and it's really based on a discussion between the special ed team and the L teacher. We look at the lost links, we look at their educational background, and then typically, you know, if the student is newer to the country or their loss is a level 1 or 2 and just seeing how they are in the classroom, then we move ahead to a bilingual evaluation. But it really is a lot of conversation with the whole team to decide. But that is one of the main times where the lost links comes into play.
And I think, you know, from the perspective of the guidance, it's essential to ensure that we are doing the screening for a student to determine if they have a disability in the language that is most likely to yield the most accurate result. So that is what the federal guidance says. And in practice, that can be really challenging because especially with lower incidence languages, it might be challenging to find assessments or find evaluators that are able to carry those out. But it is something that we are tasked to do. If you encounter that situation and you're struggling with that in your district, that is something that I know that Janet has worked with districts on, as well as I have as well, and other folks in our Special Education Bureau. And oftentimes, what I find is that it's a all hands on deck. When someone says we need a Ukrainian speaking evaluator, and they might reach out to someone in special ed and perhaps me or Janet or others. And these things do in practice are challenging, but nevertheless we are tasked to do them, and it's the responsibility of us to ensure that we are really making sure that we're properly identifying these students through appropriate assessment.
Just to echo what you're saying, Megan, I think those are situations where you can also reach out to your colleagues in the RESCs and in professional organizations as needed as well.
Absolutely, it's a great point. Thank you, Janet. Another person is seeking guidance for schools that want to call PPTs for students with non-academic concerns that may be connected to being an L. So calling a PPT for students, particularly young students at the kindergarten and first grade levels. The person is seeking guidance for schools that are, I don't want to say eager, but are interested in convening that process very young around what may appear to be language related concerns. Would anyone like to share guidance on that or suggestions?
My thought is that it would be important to get as much data as you can, and the pre-loss, if you do the 2 sections, so there's the pre-loss to determine eligibility, and then there's the pre-loss phonics section, which will tell you a lot about whether a child is able to name numbers, colors, letters. It's set up like a board game if you haven't seen it before. It's actually really fun for the child. I think all of that data would be really crucial if you're considering the PPT process for somebody so young. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime. That's my first instinct.
It seems like this is, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Cassandra.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, to piggyback on what Kendra's saying, we do it here if the student is eligible based on their test scores of the pre-loss in English and our Spanish speakers, we do give the Spanish pre-loss. So we have those to compare. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought about that. So
I'm wondering why, well, I would have to wonder why there is a thought that there is a language issue. Is it the home language survey that is revealing this to them? Why would there be, you wouldn't convene a PPT, you would, as you're saying, Megan, as you said, that EL services are tier 1. It's available if it's to everyone. So certainly we would come up with a plan to provide support for that student who, and then, you know, as Kendra said, do the pre-loss, go through those screenings. Cassandra's district has quite a extensive services there in Norwalk to help families and teachers. So I'm wondering what would be the indication to call a PPT? I'm unclear on that.
My guess is that, again, social and behavioral concerns, that's how I'm sort of inferring this question. And I would just suggest to the participant today to sort of get your colleagues involved, if you can, with the support of your building principal in an informal way. So can your speech and language pathologist pop in for a few minutes and observe and do an informal, point you in the right direction? Do you have an OT that you can connect with that can say, oh, Kendra, I have a great suggestion for this will help this child. PPT is such a structured, formal process. What can we do if there are some significant concerns with our colleagues in an observational way that gives the classroom teacher some support?
And just as a reminder.
Oh, can I just
sorry.
add one piece? So it's a great place for the input of your psychologist as well, because typical child development at the younger ages has a really broad span of what's normal, right? So kids gain skills at vastly different times, and it's all considered very typical up until, you know, around age 5. But you can see kids acquire, oh, my baby walked at 6 months. Well, my baby didn't walk for a year, and that's all considered normal, and that continues on through early childhood development. So what we may be judging as problematic or a weakness of a child could truly just be pretty typical development, in, you know, just different from what people are used to. So there seems like this question, there's a lot of things to explore, and definitely a great case for using multiple data points and the input of many different professionals to make sure that this process is truly a legitimate need and not just a reactive sort of, you know, sort of just a grabbing a solution kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a case that we probably could have an entire webinar about, like discussing that whole process and multiple measures and how to ensure that we're making the right choices for those types of circumstances. We are getting toward the end. I'm just going to raise one additional question. There were several questions about translation, and this person says, I'm a parent educator and I work for parents as teachers. While providing services to some of the L families I work with, I've seen those families struggling to translate or interpret the communications, notices, etc., that are sent by their children's schools, such as emails, letters, robocalls, just in English with no translation. Sometimes we translate for this for parents, but sometimes this is not possible. Is there any type of translation service these parents could have access to so they can understand the content of the communications they're receiving? And I would like to address this question because it is complex, it can be very challenging, but it is the right of parents to receive communications in languages that they understand. Many L students have parents that may require translation or interpretation, but there are other parents that may not have L students that may also require this. So if we think of it as a Venn diagram, there's a lot of shared space in the parents that require translation and interpretation and Ls, but that there are those parents who have L children that may not require this, and there are parents that don't have L children who may require this. So we have to be thoughtful in our communications with our families. This should be a part of your home language survey or your registration process where you're saying, do you need translation or interpretation? And if a parent does, that is something that they are entitled to receive. So it is essential that we are thinking carefully and we are thinking planfully about how to provide translation and interpretation. Oftentimes, this may be done through trained translators. It may be done through telephonic supports, on-demand translation companies that offer many different languages. Many of those services seem to be cost-effective for districts because they are essentially paid for as needed or have a low-cost subscription fee plus the pay as needed. For more general communications, there are apps. Many districts are utilizing talking points, for instance, that allows you to communicate very effectively from one language to another with parents, but that would be for less formal communication. And so particularly these formal communications related to special education, related to programmatic information, we need to ensure that. This is a growth area for the state. Many districts are grappling with this. Recently, Learn offered a translation and interpretation showcase with a lot of resources, and this is something that we will continue to kind of work with districts on, but I wanted to say how essential it is while we have this large audience to ensure that we're providing that very necessary resource to our families. And I think that takes us to the end of our time today. So on behalf of myself and the CSDE colleagues, I want to thank you very, very much, Kendra, Laura, Jane, and Cassandra. We really, really appreciated your sentiments. It adds a lot of practical application to these complex issues, and we so appreciate your participation. As I said, we will address the questions that we didn't have time to address. We do have a record of them, so stay tuned and please join us for our future offerings regarding English learners that Michael referenced. Thank you again, everyone, and we hope to see you soon.